My name is Amelia. I'm in my late 30s, a mother, a professional, and depending on who you ask, either very easy to overlook or very easy to rely on. I've spent most of my adult life being described as steady, reasonable, and low maintenance. The kind of woman people assume will always understand, always adapt, always forgive. I've learned that when people call you calm, what they often mean is quiet. And when they call you strong, what they sometimes mean is convenient. This story isn't about rage or spectacle. It's not about humiliating anyone or delivering a dramatic reveal. It's about what happens slowly, in private, when trust is bent again and again and labeled as love. It's about the moment you realize that endurance, without boundaries, becomes permission. My husband asked me to forgive his affair, then repeated it. It's a fact, one that took me years to say out loud without shaking. When it happened the first time, I believed in repair. I believed in context. I believed that remorse meant change. I told myself that marriages survive worse things than betrayal if both people are willing to do the work. But over time, apologies became patterns. What you're about to hear is not a countdown to revenge. There are no shouting matches here, no scenes where someone gets what they deserve in the way movies promise. This is a documentary-style account of how emotional dynamics actually shift, quietly, internally, long before anything visible changes on the outside. I'll walk you through who I was in that marriage, how I was seen, and how I slowly understood the role I had been assigned. I'll share the small moments that didn't look like turning points at the time, but were. The silences that were mistaken for weakness. The choices that were made long before anyone thought I was making them. I'm telling this story because many people, especially women, are taught that dignity means absorbing pain gracefully, that staying calm makes you mature. Leaving loudly is worse than staying quietly. I believed those things for a long time. I also believed that if I just explained myself better, loved more patiently, and forgave more completely, the story would end differently. It didn't. What it did instead was teach me the difference between forgiveness and self-erasure, between peace and passivity, between love and tolerance of harm. I won't spoil where this story ends, but I will promise you this. It ends honestly, not with bitterness, not with theatrics, but with clarity. If you've ever been the person who stayed composed while something inside you was quietly reorganizing, you may recognize yourself here. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever felt underestimated? Not because you were weak, but because you were calm. I used to think that being seen as dependable was a kind of love. Not the loud kind, not the kind people post about, but the quiet trust that settles into the background of a life. I was the person everyone leaned on, the one who remembered birthdays without reminders, the one who stayed calm when plans collapsed, who filled in gaps without announcing I was doing it. In my marriage, that steadiness became my defining feature. To my husband, I was the reasonable one. He said it often, usually with a small smile, as if it were a compliment that explained everything else. Reasonable meant I didn't overreact. Reasonable meant I didn't ask too many questions. Reasonable meant I could be relied upon to keep the emotional temperature low, even when something clearly wasn't right. When friends described us, they'd say he was passionate, driven, intense, and I was grounding, the balance, the calm. What they didn't see was how that calm slowly became a role I was expected to perform. At dinners, conversations flowed around me. I wasn't ignored exactly. I was included in a way that didn't require much from anyone else. People assumed I was fine because I looked fine. I asked questions, listened carefully, and nodded. I was good at making others feel understood, and bad at that time at asking for the same in return. No one worried about me. I gave off the impression that I didn't need to be worried about. In my marriage, that invisibility was subtle. It showed up in decisions made without checking in jokes that landed a little too close to the truth, followed by, I didn't mean it like that. In plans that adjusted around his schedule, his stress, his ambitions, while mine stayed flexible, portable, secondary, not dismissed, just quietly deprioritized. I told myself this was a partnership, compromise, maturity. I was proud of how little drama there was in our lives, proud that we didn't fight like other couples, proud that when something hurt, I could process it privately and move on without making it a problem. I didn't realize that what I was really proud of was my ability to disappear emotionally when it was convenient for others. To his family, I was the good one, the stable one, the wife who didn't make waves. I absorbed that identity without question. It felt safer than being seen as demanding or emotional. I had learned, long before this marriage, that women who articulate discomfort too clearly are often labeled difficult. So I refined my silence until it looked like grace. When the first betrayal happened, though I didn't know yet that there would be a second, I wasn't shocked in the way people imagine. I was stunned, yes, but more than that, I was confused. Confused because it didn't match the role I had been playing. I had done everything right. I had been patient, loyal, and understanding. I had made myself easy to be married to. In hindsight, that belief, that love is something you earn by being low friction, was the most dangerous one I carried. At the time, though, I still thought of myself as visible. I thought people saw my value, even if they didn't say it out loud. I believed that being indispensable meant being respected. I didn't yet understand that you can be necessary and still be taken for granted, that you can be trusted with responsibilities, but not with truth. This part of the story matters because it explains why nothing exploded immediately. Why was there no dramatic exit? No public reckoning? I was someone people assumed would stay. Someone who had always adapted before. Someone whose silence had been mistaken for acceptance so many times that it began to feel permanent. I didn't see myself as weak. I saw myself as composed. I didn't see myself as invisible. I saw myself as supportive. It took time, more time than I'm proud of, to realize that the way people see you is often shaped by what you never challenge. And I had been very good at not challenging anything at all. The first small cut didn't look like betrayal. That's important to say. It didn't arrive with proof or confrontation or a moment you could clearly point to and say, "This is where everything broke." It came disguised as something forgettable, something easily dismissed, something everyone else would have told me I was overthinking. It was a change in tone. I remember the exact moment because of how ordinary it was. We were in the kitchen, early evening, the kind of hour where the day hasn't quite ended, but the night hasn't started yet. He was scrolling through his phone, half listening, when I mentioned a work opportunity I'd been excited about. Nothing dramatic, just a possible leadership role, more responsibility, more visibility. I hadn't even decided if I wanted it yet. I just wanted to share the thought. He smiled without looking up and said, "That sounds like a lot. Are you sure you want to add stress right now?" The words themselves were reasonable, protective even. Anyone else would have heard concern. But there was something underneath it, something subtle and sharp that caught my attention. Not worry for me, but certainty about me. As if my capacity had already been measured and quietly capped. I paused, not outwardly, inside. I noticed how quickly the conversation moved on, how it didn't ask follow-up questions, how my excitement evaporated without needing to be challenged. I nodded, said maybe he was right, and the moment passed. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. That night, lying awake, I replayed the exchange. Not because it was dramatic, but because it felt new. I had spent years being encouraged to support his growth, his ambitions, his risks. I had rearranged my time, my energy, my expectations to make space for them. And here, without argument, without discussion, my own possibility had been gently closed like a door. I didn't bring it up again. I told myself I was being sensitive. That is not every comment needed to be examined. Healthy relationships don't require constant analysis. I reminded myself that peace was fragile, and I was good at preserving it. That was the first cut. Small enough that no one else saw it. Clean enough that it didn't bleed, but deep enough that I remembered it. After that, there were others. Not many at first. A joke at a dinner party where my contribution was summarized as, "Amelia keeps everything running." A decision was made about a holiday without asking what I wanted to do. A private message that appeared on his phone and disappeared too quickly when I entered the room, followed by a casual explanation that made sense if you didn't listen too closely. Each time the pattern was the same. A moment of internal pause, a quiet note taken somewhere inside me, and then silence. Everyone else ignored these moments because they were easy to ignore. There was no evidence, no raised voices, no change in public behavior. To the outside world, we were fine, good even, stable. The kind of couple people used as an example of how maturity looks. I participated in that illusion. I smiled. I hosted. I smoothed over edges before they became visible. I became even more composed, as if calm could compensate for unease. What I didn't realize yet was that my mind had begun doing something new. It wasn't accusing. It wasn't planned. It was simply a recording, storing impressions instead of emotions. not reacting, but observing. That first small cut taught me something, though I wouldn't name it until much later. The earliest signs of disrespect are rarely loud. There are quite a few assumptions. Decisions are made about you instead of with you. A slow rewriting of who you are allowed to be, done gently enough that you thank the person holding the pen. I didn't confront him. I didn't even fully confront myself. But something shifted. A hairline fracture in the story I'd been telling myself about who we were and who I was allowed to become within that marriage. Everyone else forgot those moments as soon as they passed. I didn't. Once something happens twice, your mind starts looking for a framework to contain it. Not to expose it, but to live with it. That's what I did. I didn't call what I was experiencing disrespect. I called it miscommunication. I called it timing. I called it stress. Words that make discomfort feel temporary, fixable, and unthreatening. The first time I noticed him withholding details, I told myself privacy wasn't secrecy. The second time, I reminded myself that long marriages have phases where people turn inward. By the third time, I had constructed an entire internal explanation that made his distance logical and my unease unnecessary. That's how normalization begins. Not with denial, but with generosity. He started being less available emotionally in ways that were easy to excuse. Shorter answers, a distracted presence, moments where I'd be talking and realize he hadn't heard a word I'd said. When I paused mid-sentence and waited, he'd smile and say, "Sorry, what were you saying?" in a tone that implied it didn't really matter. I laughed it off. I always did. I told myself I was mature for not taking it personally, that I understood how demanding his life had become. That love didn't require constant attention. I wore my patience like a badge of honor, unaware that it was slowly erasing my right to expect reciprocity. There were times I almost spoke up. Tiny moments where a sentence rose to the surface. That hurt, or I feel invisible right now, but I swallowed it. Not because I was afraid of conflict, but because I believed conflict meant failure. If I could just adjust my expectations, everything would stay intact. This is where I need to be honest. I participated in my own minimization. I smoothed things over before they had a chance to sharpen. I edited myself in real time, cutting out anything that might be inconvenient. When he forgot something important to me, I told myself it wasn't intentional. When he dismissed a concern with "you're reading too much into it," I questioned my own perception instead of his behavior. And when the first affair was revealed, months later, I wasn't blindsided by the fact of betrayal. I was blindsided by how quickly the narrative shifted to forgiveness. He was remorseful, convincingly so. He cried, he apologized. He explained stress, loneliness, a lapse in judgment. He said all the right things, and because I had already trained myself to be understanding, I received them without resistance. I became the container for his guilt. Everyone praised my grace, my strength, my willingness to work through it. They told me how admirable I was, how not everyone could handle something like that with such composure. I absorbed those compliments like proof that staying quiet was the right choice. What no one asked was whether forgiveness had been requested or expected. In the aftermath, boundaries were discussed in theory, but never enforced in practice. Transparency was promised, but inconsistently delivered. Trust was treated like something that could be restored by intention alone, without structural change. And I accepted that, because accepting had become my default. Apologies became patterns. That sentence took me a long time to understand. At first, I thought repetition meant carelessness, that if someone was sorry enough, they wouldn't do the same thing again. But remorse without transformation isn't repair, it's rehearsal. And each time I accepted an apology that wasn't followed by change, I taught him something about what I would tolerate. I also taught myself something more damaging, that my discomfort was negotiable. I learned how to live in a state of quiet disappointment without letting it show. I learned how to reassure him when he felt ashamed, even as something inside me hardened. I learned how to speak in neutral tones about things that should have mattered more. This wasn't selflessness. It was self-abandonment dressed up as maturity. By normalizing what hurt me, I made it ordinary. And once something becomes ordinary, people stop noticing it altogether, including you. I didn't see the second betrayal coming, not because there were no signs, but because I had trained myself to reinterpret every sign as something else. I had become fluent in translating disrespect into patience. What I didn't know yet was that patience, when it's one-sided, doesn't preserve a relationship. It preserves a hierarchy. There's a moment in some lives, not loud, not dramatic, when you realize you've been cast, not chosen, not consulted, but placed into a role that serves the story other people want to keep telling. For me, that realization came quietly, through repetition rather than revelation. I was the reliable one, not just in my marriage, but everywhere. The person who would handle things, the one who didn't need managing, the one whose emotions were assumed to be under control, even when no one had checked. In theory, it sounded like respect. In practice, it meant I was expected to absorb inconvenience without complaint. In my marriage, this role became invisible but rigid. I was expected to understand his stress, his restlessness, his mistakes. I was expected to contextualize his behavior in the most generous light possible. When something went wrong, the unspoken assumption was that I would help fix it, or at least make sure it didn't spill out into the open. There was no conversation where this role was assigned, no agreement I signed. It emerged naturally from years of my being capable, calm, and accommodating. And once it was established, deviating from it felt like a breach of character. I noticed it in how the conflict was framed. When I expressed discomfort, carefully, tentatively, it was treated as an anomaly, something to be smoothed over quickly so we could return to normal. My feelings weren't dismissed outright. They were managed, reduced, contained. He would say things like, "I know you'll understand," before I'd even responded, or, "You're not like other people, you don't overreact." Those statements weren't compliments. There were instructions, reminders of who I was supposed to be in order to remain acceptable. I internalized them. I became more careful with my words, more strategic with my timing. I waited until he seemed calm, receptive, unburdened before bringing anything up, if I brought it up at all. And if the response wasn't what I hoped for, I quietly folded the concern back into myself and moved on. From the outside, this looked like emotional intelligence. Inside, it felt like compression. The second affair didn't arrive with chaos. It arrived with familiarity, the same explanations, the same expressions of regret, the same insistence that it didn't reflect how he truly felt about me. And again, the expectation, never stated but clearly present, was that I would be the one to stabilize the aftermath. I realized then that I wasn't just forgiving him. I was preserving the image of the marriage for everyone else. I was protecting him from the full weight of his choices. And I was doing it at the expense of my own internal coherence. The role I had been assigned didn't include anger, or ultimatums, or visible grief. It certainly didn't include leaving. It included endurance, rationality. Emotional labor is performed quietly and competently. Once I saw that role clearly, I couldn't unsee it. I noticed how quickly people assumed I'd be fine, how rarely anyone asked what I wanted to do next, how suggestions about working through it were directed at me, not him, as if repair were my responsibility by default. That realization didn't make me angry, it made me alert, because roles only hold power as long as you continue to perform them without question. And for the first time, I began to consider what would happen if I didn't. I didn't announce this shift. I didn't threaten change. I didn't even articulate it fully to myself yet. But something loosened inside me, a sense that I was allowed to step outside the character I'd been playing. The role of the reliable one had given me stability, but it had also made me predictable. And predictability, I would later learn, is not the same as safety. That was the moment I stopped asking how to fix the marriage and started asking a different question entirely. What happens if I stop protecting everyone else from the consequences of their assumptions about me? The day something shifted didn't come with an argument or a discovery. There was no confrontation, no new evidence, no sentence that split my life into before and after. In fact, if you'd asked anyone else what happened that day, they wouldn't have been able to tell you anything at all. It was a morning like many others. The house was quiet in that way. It only is after routine has taken over. Familiar, almost mechanical. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, scrolling through emails, not really reading them. He was in the other room, moving around, getting ready for the day. The sounds were ordinary, predictable. And suddenly, without warning, I felt detached. Not numb, not sad, just separate. I remember thinking, very calmly, I don't feel anxious right now. That realization surprised me. For months, maybe longer, there had been a low-level tension humming beneath everything. Constant monitoring. An unconscious effort to anticipate his moods, his needs, the state of the relationship. That morning, the hum was gone. In its place was clarity. I realized that I wasn't afraid of losing the marriage anymore. Not because I didn't care, but because I had already been living without the security I thought it provided. The fear had been doing the work of keeping me compliant, and when it disappeared, so did the urgency to fix anything. I watched him move through the house and felt no impulse to adjust myself around him. I didn't rush to be pleasant. I didn't brace for impact. I didn't prepare an emotional cushion in case the day went badly. I just observed. That was new. It wasn't a decision. It was a release. A quiet internal acknowledgement that I could stop trying to manage an outcome that wasn't actually in my control. For the first time, I allowed the possibility that the marriage might end and that I would still be intact. That thought didn't scare me, it steadied me. Later that day, something small happened. He mentioned a plan he'd made without consulting me. Nothing major, nothing worth arguing over by most standards. Normally, I would have adapted immediately, rearranged my schedule, and told myself it didn't matter. Instead, I said, I already have plans. My tone was neutral, factual. He looked surprised, not offended, just momentarily disoriented, as if the script had skipped a line. He nodded, adjusted his plan, and moved on. The moment passed, but inside me something locked into place. I realized that my power hadn't been taken from me. I had been offering it, in small increments, every time I made myself more flexible than necessary. Every time I prioritized harmony over honesty, and I could stop offering it at any time, without announcement. That day, I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse or demand. I didn't even articulate what had changed. I went about my day as usual. I worked. I picked up groceries. I made dinner. Externally, nothing shifted. Internally, everything had. I began to see silence differently, not as something imposed on me, but as something I could choose. I didn't need to explain myself for safety. I didn't need to prove my worth through patience. I could observe, decide, and act without inviting debate. This wasn't the beginning of a plan. It was the end of a reflex. From that point on, I stopped reaching automatically for forgiveness, not out of spite, but because forgiveness requires a change to attach to. I stopped filling in emotional gaps that weren't mine to fill. I stopped managing his comfort at the expense of my own coherence. The shift was so subtle that he didn't notice it at first. No one did. I was still calm, still composed, still reliable on the surface. But the motivation underneath had changed. I was no longer preserving the marriage at all costs. I was preserving myself. And once that shift happens, once you stop orienting your life around preventing loss, you start seeing options that were always there, quietly waiting. Before that shift, my silence had been reactive. A pause meant to keep things smooth, a way to buy time, avoid friction, and preserve the image of stability. After that morning, silence became something else entirely. It became intentional. I stopped explaining my inner world. Not because I was hiding, but because I realized how often explanation had been used against me, how clarity was interpreted as negotiable, how vulnerability had been treated as an opening rather than a trust. So I spoke less, not colder, not harsher, just more selectively. I answered questions directly. I stopped filling the space with reassurance. When something didn't work for me, I stated it plainly, without justification. No long preambles, no emotional cushioning. Others mistook this for withdrawal. They assumed I was tired, or processing, or being patient in my own way. My husband, in particular, read my calm as compliance. He seemed relieved, as if my lack of visible reaction confirmed that things were under control, that I was, once again, handling it. I let him believe that. This wasn't manipulation. It was a correction. I was no longer volunteering emotional labor that had never been reciprocated. I wasn't trying to change his behavior through confrontation. I was changing mine through restraint. Silence gave me space to observe without interference, to notice patterns without rushing to interpret them generously. I paid attention to what happened when I didn't step in to stabilize, when I didn't soften truths or anticipate needs. What I saw was instructive. When I stopped compensating, the imbalance became visible. His assumptions surfaced more clearly. His apologies followed the same structure, the same language, the same arc. Regret, reassurance, return to normal. Without my participation, they landed differently, hollow, rehearsed. And still I said nothing. I wasn't waiting for a confession or a moment to pounce. I was waiting for myself to feel grounded enough to choose without urgency. Silence allowed that. It slowed the pace. It removed the pressure to resolve anything quickly. I began documenting, not in writing, not yet, but mentally, dates, reactions, inconsistencies. Not as evidence for an argument, but as information for myself. I wanted clarity, not validation. There's a difference between quiet dominance and passive endurance. One drains you, the other consolidates you. I could feel the difference in my body, less tension in my shoulders, fewer mental rehearsals, more sleep. People often assume that when someone goes quiet, they are losing ground, that they've given up, that they are afraid to speak. What they don't consider is that silence can also mean decision-making. I wasn't waiting for permission to leave. I wasn't waiting for proof to justify my feelings. I was letting the reality of the situation reveal itself without interference, and it did. He didn't notice my silence as a boundary. He experienced it as relief. The absence of challenge confirmed his belief that things were manageable, that whatever discomfort existed could be smoothed over without structural change. That misinterpretation worked in my favor, because while he was settling back into familiarity, I was recalibrating, reclaiming attention, redirecting energy, asking myself questions I'd avoided for years, not, can this be fixed? But what do I want my life to look like if it isn't? Silence gave me the answer before words ever could. I wasn't angry, I wasn't plotting, I was preparing, not for confrontation, but for alignment, for a version of myself that didn't require constant adjustment to remain acceptable. And the more intentional my silence became, the more I realized how much power I had been giving away simply by explaining myself too much. When you stop narrating your pain for people who benefit from not understanding it, something remarkable happens. You get very, very clear. What they never noticed was how much space silence creates. When you stop reacting in real time, you reclaim hours, mental bandwidth, energy that used to be spent interpreting tone, smoothing tension, and anticipating fallout. That space doesn't stay empty for long. It fills itself with observation. I began to see the structure of my life with unusual clarity. I noticed how many systems I already managed without recognition. Finances, I understood better than I let on. Schedules that ran smoothly because I made them that way. Relationships with lawyers, accountants, colleagues, people who saw me not as calm or easy, but as precise and capable. I had built a quiet infrastructure around myself without ever labeling it as power. And because no one thought I needed leverage, no one watched me closely. I started learning, deliberately but invisibly, not in secretive ways, just without announcing it. I revisited documents I hadn't looked at in years. I read policies, contracts, and statements. I asked neutral questions in professional settings that had nothing to do with my marriage and everything to do with my autonomy. At home, I didn't change my demeanor. I cooked, I listened, I responded when spoken to. I remained observant, not absent. The absence was internal. My emotional availability was no longer automatic. What surprised me most was how little resistance there was to this shift. No one pushed back. No one demanded explanations. That's when I understood something critical. People rarely object when you stop overgiving. They simply adjust to receiving less. I paid attention to timing, to patterns of behavior that repeated when accountability was low, to how apologies were offered not as commitments to change, but as resets. Buttons meant to return everything to baseline. I stopped pressing that button for him. Instead, I kept notes, sometimes literal ones, in that leather-bound notebook I'd carried for years without using. Dates, observations, not judgments, facts. It wasn't about building a case against him. It was about building trust in myself. Preparation doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like patience without hope attached to it. I also noticed how invisible competence works both ways. Just as my emotional labor had been taken for granted, my strategic thinking had been underestimated. People assumed I was too gentle to be decisive, too composed to be resolute. That assumption gave me cover. While he believed we were stabilizing, I was orienting. While he believed time would smooth things over, I was letting time show me exactly what wouldn't change. There was no rush, no deadline. The urgency was gone. That's what they never noticed. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was positioning. Not for revenge, not for drama, for inevitability. When you stop trying to be understood by people who benefit from misunderstanding you, your actions become quieter and far more effective. I wasn't hiding. I simply wasn't announcing myself. And in that quiet, something solid took shape. A sense of readiness that didn't require validation. A confidence that came not from anger, but from alignment. By the time anyone realized I was preparing for something, the preparation was already complete. The private reveal didn't arrive like a shock. There was no rush of adrenaline, No triumphant moment where everything suddenly made sense. It came the way most truths do, when you're no longer avoiding them, quietly, almost politely, as if it had been waiting for me to be ready. I was alone when it happened. No witnesses, no audience. I had been going through documents one evening, not searching for anything in particular. That's the part people often misunderstand. I wasn't hunting for proof. I wasn't suspicious in the frantic sense. I was thorough, curious, calm. When you stop needing a specific outcome, you can finally see what's actually there. What I found wasn't a single explosive revelation. It was a pattern made visible, timelines that didn't align, accounts that were technically transparent but strategically incomplete, communications that had been minimized in description but expanded in reality. Nothing illegal, nothing cinematic, just enough clarity to remove all remaining doubt. The leverage wasn't scandalous. It wasn't something I could weaponize publicly even if I wanted to. And that's exactly why it mattered. Because leverage doesn't always mean exposure. Sometimes it means understanding the true shape of the situation, who depends on what, who benefits from which assumptions, and where the pressure points actually are. I sat with that knowledge for a long time, longer than I expected. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel angry. What I felt was settled. For years, uncertainty had been doing emotional damage. The wondering, the interpreting, the constant recalibration of my own instincts. That night, the uncertainty dissolved. In its place was clarity that didn't demand action, only acknowledgement. I remember thinking, so this is what I've been carrying. Not rage, wait. The reveal wasn't about him as much as it was about me. About how much I had already survived while pretending I wasn't affected. About how skilled I had become at adapting to instability. About how unnecessary that skill set would be in a life I chose deliberately. I didn't confront him, not then. I didn't change my behavior. I didn't hint or imply. Knowledge, I learned, doesn't need to be announced to be powerful. It only needs to be integrated. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months. The days that followed were almost peaceful. With clarity comes a strange calm. I stopped checking for signs. I stopped monitoring emotional weather. I no longer needed to read between the lines because the lines themselves were clear. This was the point of no return, not because I had decided to leave, but because I could no longer pretend that staying required confusion. Any choice I made from here on would be informed, and informed choices changed the balance of power immediately. I also realized something else, something subtle but important. I didn't want him to know what I knew, not yet, not because I was afraid, but because revelation is not the same as resolution. Telling him would only invite negotiation, explanation, and performance. I wasn't interested in performance anymore. The private reveal gave me something I hadn't had before, timing. I no longer felt behind the story, reacting to developments as they unfolded. I was ahead of it, quietly deciding where I wanted to stand when it reached its natural conclusion. I began to imagine my future without emotional bargaining, without the need to justify why something hurt, without apologizing for wanting consistency. Those imaginings weren't fantasies. They were logistical, practical, real, and perhaps most importantly, I felt no urge to punish him with this knowledge. That surprised me. I had assumed clarity would come with heat. It didn't. It came with detachment. When you finally see the truth without needing to use it against someone, you know you're no longer entangled in the outcome. The reveal didn't make me stronger overnight. It confirmed that I already was. From that point on, everything I did was guided by one principle. Move in a way that requires no explanation later, no scrambling, no retroactive justification. Just alignment between what I knew and how I lived. The decision hadn't been made yet, but the conditions had. And once conditions change, endings stop being dramatic. They become inevitable. People imagine decisions as moments, singular, dramatic, irreversible. A line drawn, a door slammed. For me, the decision point was quieter than that. It unfolded over several days, maybe weeks, as I tested what it felt like to live from clarity instead of habit. I already knew the options. I had always known them. Stay and continue negotiating my boundaries, leave and rebuild, or remain in place while hollowing out slowly. What changed wasn't the menu, it was my tolerance. I asked myself questions I had avoided before, not because they were complex, but because they were honest. If nothing changed from here, could I live this life without resentment? If I forgave again, what precedent would I be setting for myself? Not him, me. What would staying require me to become? The answers came without drama, no spirals, no tears, just a steady sense of no. That was when I understood the irreversible choice wasn't leaving. It was no longer negotiating my own reality. I watched him carefully during that time, not with suspicion but with clarity. I noticed how easily comfort returned when there was no resistance. How apologies remained verbal but unaccompanied by structural change. How the version of the future he described always required my flexibility, my understanding, my emotional labor. He wasn't cruel. That made it harder, not easier. He was simply consistent in a way that no longer worked for me. I also noticed something else. He assumed time was on his side, that I would eventually settle back into the role I'd always played, that my calm meant continuity. He didn't see the decision forming because it wasn't emotional. It was logistical. One evening, I sat alone and imagined two futures, not in abstract terms, but in detail. The rhythms of daily life, the emotional climate, the person I would need to be in each scenario. One future required me to stay vigilant, adaptive, quietly disappointed. The other required discomfort, yes, but also honesty, coherence, and eventual peace. Only one of those futures felt dignified. That's what tipped the scales. I didn't feel brave. I felt aligned. There's a difference. Bravery implies fear. Alignment implies recognition. I wasn't stepping into the unknown. I was stepping out of self-betrayal. The decision, once made internally, didn't rush me. It steadied me further. I didn't announce it. I didn't threaten it. I didn't seek reassurance. Decisions that need applause are usually still unsure. From that moment on, my actions had a different weight. Conversations became data, not negotiations. Time became something I protected, not something I spent trying to fix someone else's behavior. I stopped wondering how things might turn out and started ensuring they would turn out cleanly. This was the irreversible choice. I would act in a way that honored what I knew, even if no one else knew it yet. There would be no dramatic ultimatum, no attempt to extract remorse, no demand for understanding. The decision had already removed me from that dynamic entirely. Once you choose yourself without anger, the path forward becomes surprisingly clear. The next steps weren't emotional, they were practical, quiet, methodical, and no one noticed. Once the decision was made, urgency disappeared. That surprised me. I had expected fear or second-guessing or a rush to get out before I changed my mind. Instead, what I felt was steadiness, the kind that allows you to move carefully without broadcasting every step. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, not friends, not family, not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't need outside energy shaping something that had to be precise. Silence protected the process. I started with structure. I reviewed finances with a clarity I'd never needed before. Not to take anything that wasn't fair, not to hide or manipulate, but to understand exactly where I stood. Accounts, assets, obligations. I made copies of documents I was entitled to have and stored them somewhere neutral. I adjusted nothing yet. I just made sure there would be no surprises later. I consulted professionals quietly, framed as general inquiries. No drama, no accusations, just information. I asked what timelines looked like, what options existed, what preparation made sense before any conversation took place. I listened more than I spoke. At home, nothing changed on the surface. I didn't withdraw affection abruptly. I didn't provoke conflict. I remained calm, consistent, and observant. That consistency was interpreted as stability, which allowed me to keep moving without interference. He continued assuming time would smooth things over. That assumption was the cover I needed. I also began disentangling emotionally in practical ways. I stopped planning far into the future. I stopped making sacrifices that would bind me tighter. I redirected energy toward my work, my health, my autonomy. These weren't acts of revenge. They were acts of rebalancing. What moving in silence taught me is this: the loudest part of separation is often internal. Externally, it can look like nothing is happening at all. Internally, everything is aligning toward exit. I paid attention to my timing. I didn't want to leave in a moment of emotion or reaction. I wanted to leave from stability, when my life could absorb the transition without chaos. That required patience. I had learned patience the hard way, but this time it served me. There were moments he sensed something, not enough to name, just a faint confusion. He'd ask if I was okay. I'd say yes, because in the most important way, I was. I wasn't pretending. I simply wasn't sharing. Silence protected my clarity from negotiation. If I had spoken too soon, the conversation would have shifted toward repair, explanation, or performance. I wasn't interested in that. I was interested in resolution. Every step I took was reversible in theory, but purposeful in direction. I wasn't burning bridges, I was loosening knots. And because there was no spectacle, no accusation, no visible anger, no one intervened. No one tried to talk me out of anything. No one suspected that an ending was already in motion. That's the power of moving in silence. You get to finish your thinking before anyone else starts theirs. By the time the first external consequence appeared, everything that mattered had already been arranged. The consequences didn't announce themselves. They arrived softly, almost politely, like a change in the weather you only notice once you're already in it. The first sign wasn't conflict. It was an absence. I stopped compensating for things he didn't do. When he forgot something, it stayed forgotten. When plans fell through, I didn't scramble to fix them. When emotional labor was required, I no longer volunteered automatically. I wasn't punishing him. I was simply no longer buffering reality. That shift created friction, not loud, but disorienting. He began to feel unsettled without knowing why. Things that used to just work stopped doing so. He noticed that I wasn't as available, but couldn't point to a specific change. I was still kind, still present, still calm. But the infrastructure I had quietly maintained was no longer invisible. This is how consequences often begin. Not with loss, but with confusion. He became more attentive in small ways, asking questions, checking in, but it lacked depth. It was reactive, not reflective. An attempt to restore equilibrium without examining what had disrupted it. I didn't respond by opening up. I responded by staying consistent. Consistency is unnerving when someone is used to elasticity. He also began to experience the emotional weight he'd been insulated from. When discomfort arose, there was no immediate soothing. When guilt surfaced, there was no reassurance. He had to sit with it. That was new. Still, there was no confrontation, no accusation. I let the consequences do their quiet work. I trusted the process I had set in motion. Others noticed too, though they couldn't articulate it. Friends commented that I seemed different, more grounded, less accommodating. They meant it as an observation, not a critique. I took it as confirmation. What struck me most was how little I needed to explain. The narrative began to shift without my participation. People sensed something was changing, and instead of demanding clarity, they adjusted their expectations. He, however, felt the loss more acutely. Not the loss of me entirely, that hadn't happened yet, but the loss of the version of me who made things easy, the version that absorbed tension and smoothed outcomes. That loss registered before any formal ending because it affected his daily experience. He started asking if we should talk. I agreed, but only in small doses. I didn't unload years of hurt. I didn't revisit old arguments. I spoke in present terms, calmly, minimally, enough to be honest, not enough to invite debate. That restraint frustrated him. Without emotional intensity to push against, there was nothing to argue with, nothing to fix. Only the quiet awareness that something essential had shifted beyond quick repair. This is where many people expect drama. Tears, ultimatums, emotional bargaining. None of that happened. The consequences weren't punitive. They were proportional. I had stopped offering what was never reciprocated, and the absence of that offering revealed how much it had been doing all along. By the time he realized that something fundamental was being withdrawn, not affection, not kindness, but coverage, the dynamic had already changed. The process was irreversible, not because of any single action, but because the balance had shifted permanently. I was no longer the one carrying the weight of the relationship alone. And when weight shifts after being uneven for so long, the structure always feels it. By the time panic appeared, the window for repair had already closed. It didn't look like panic at first. It looked like an effort. Sudden attentiveness, offers to talk, to change, to do whatever it takes. The language shifted from reassurance to urgency. He began referencing the future more insistently, as if naming it could secure it. I listened, calmly, carefully. What I heard wasn't a transformation, it was fear of loss. That distinction matters. Fear can motivate action, but it rarely sustains change. I had already lived through apologies fueled by fear. I knew their shape. I knew how quickly they dissolved once stability returned. He wanted to fix us. I needed to fix myself, or rather, stop breaking myself to keep something intact that no longer honored me. He asked what I needed. That question came years too late, because what I needed then wasn't a promise. It wasn't transparency retroactively offered. It wasn't a renewed commitment under pressure. What I needed was a partner who had changed when there was still time to do so, without consequence. Regret is loud, responsibility is quiet. I noticed how often his words were about endings he didn't want, rather than harm he had done. About what he stood to lose, rather than what I had endured. Even now, the center of gravity was tilted. I didn't point that out. I didn't need to. Understanding doesn't always require explanation. The confusion deepened for him when he realized I wasn't escalating. I wasn't issuing ultimatums. I wasn't listing grievances. I was steady, composed, resolved. That frightened him more than anger would have. Anger can be negotiated with, resolution cannot. He suggested counseling. I told him I supported him seeking it for himself. I didn't commit to attending together, not because I didn't believe in growth, but because growth under threat of loss is rarely about the person you've hurt. I could see him trying to reach the version of me he remembered, the one who would soften, who would prioritize repair over self-preservation. That version didn't exist anymore. This is the cruel irony of delayed accountability. By the time it arrives sincerely, the person who needed it most has already adapted beyond the need for it. I wasn't closed off. I was complete. There was sadness, yes, a quiet grief for what could have been if honesty had arrived sooner. But grief doesn't automatically reopen doors. Sometimes it simply confirms that the loss is real. He asked if it was too late. I didn't answer immediately, not to punish him, but because the question deserved honesty, not comfort. When I finally spoke, I said only what was true. It's not about time, I said. It's about trust. Trust, once eroded repeatedly, doesn't respond to urgency. It responds to consistency, and consistency had been missing when it mattered most. That was the moment he understood, not everything, but enough. The panic sharpened, the regret deepened, and still nothing could be reversed. Not because I was unwilling to forgive, but forgiveness without safety is not a virtue, it's a liability. And I was no longer willing to be one. When the confrontation finally happened, it didn't resemble anything I'd imagined in earlier years. There was no raised voice, no emotional surge, no release of long-suppressed anger. It was, if anything, almost quiet to the point of discomfort. We sat across from each other at the same table where so many conversations had been softened, redirected, postponed. The familiarity of the setting contrasted sharply with the finality of the moment. I noticed small details, the way the light fell, the steadiness of my hands. I felt present, grounded. I didn't come prepared with a list. I didn't recount every wound. There was no need. The story had already been told through my actions. I spoke slowly, deliberately, not to control the conversation, but to ensure accuracy. I explained that I was no longer willing to live in a relationship where trust had to be renegotiated repeatedly, that my calm should never have been mistaken for consent, that forgiveness offered without change had cost me more than it should have. He listened, really listened. I could see it in his posture, in the way he didn't interrupt. This wasn't a debate, it was an accounting. He apologized again. The words were sincere. I accepted them, not as an invitation to continue, but as an acknowledgement of reality. Apologies don't obligate reconciliation. They simply close the loop on truth. I told him I wasn't angry. That seemed to unsettle him more than anything else. Anger would have meant we were still negotiating emotional ground. Calm meant I had already moved beyond that. We talked about logistics, about timelines, about how to handle things with respect and minimal disruption. The conversation was practical because the emotional work had already been done by me over months of quiet alignment. At one point, he asked if there was anything he could say to change my mind. I paused, not for effect, but because the answer mattered. No, I said, and that's not punishment, it's clarity. I wasn't leaving to teach him a lesson. I was leaving because staying would have required me to become smaller than I was willing to be. The absence of heat didn't make the confrontation easier. It made it undeniable. There was no chaos to blame, no emotional excess to dismiss, just a calm, irreversible truth. When it ended, there were no dramatics. No slammed doors, just a quiet understanding that something had concluded because it could not continue honestly. I left the table feeling neither victorious nor devastated. I felt complete. That's what people rarely talk about. The power of a confrontation without heat. When you no longer need to convince, persuade, or perform, your words land exactly where they need to. And once they do, there's nothing left to say. Who I am now is not the opposite of who I was then. I didn't become harder, colder, or less compassionate. I became more accurate. I still value calm. I still listen carefully. I still believe in generosity. The difference is that none of those qualities is available at my expense anymore. They are choices, not reflexes. After everything ended, people expected the transformation to be loud. Reinvention, declarations. I didn't feel the need for any of that. The most meaningful changes happened internally, where no one could applaud them. I trust my perception now. That might be the greatest shift of all. Where I once questioned my instincts, I now treat them as data. Where I once explained myself excessively, I now state my boundaries plainly. Where I once believed endurance was proof of love, I now understand that love requires safety to exist at all. There is no bitterness here. That surprises people. They expect anger to linger, to color everything that comes after. But anger is what you feel when something is unresolved. This was resolved, not perfectly, not painlessly, but completely. I carry what I learned without carrying the weight of it. I no longer confuse being needed with being valued. I no longer accept roles that require me to disappear to function. I no longer mistake consistency for commitment unless it's matched by action. And perhaps most importantly, I am no longer afraid of endings. Endings are not failures. They are information. They tell you what a system can no longer support. They show you where growth has outpaced structure. They reveal who you had to become to survive and who you no longer need to be. My life now is quieter in a different way. Not because I'm suppressing anything, but because there is less internal conflict, less self-negotiation, less background noise. I didn't win anything. I didn't take anything. I didn't prove anything to anyone else. I simply stopped abandoning myself. That choice continues to shape everything: how I work, how I love, how I listen, how I leave when something no longer aligns. There is dignity in that. A calm that doesn't require performance. If there is strength here, it isn't in what I endured. It's in what I refuse to endure again. There's a temptation, when a story ends without spectacle, to wonder if something is missing. No grand justice, no visible collapse, no moment where everyone finally understands what you endured. But closure doesn't require an audience. It requires alignment. For a long time, I thought moral endings looked like balance being restored, pain matched with consequence, loss answered with remorse. I don't believe that anymore. Real closure is quieter. It's when you no longer need the other person to see you clearly in order to live clearly yourself. This story wasn't about an affair, not really. That was the catalyst, not the core. The core was what repeated forgiveness, unaccompanied by change, slowly teaches you about your own limits, about how easily compassion can be misread as capacity, about how often calm is mistaken for consent. When my husband asked me to forgive his affair the first time, I believed forgiveness was a bridge back to safety. When he repeated it, I understood something essential. Forgiveness without transformation doesn't restore trust. It trains people how to lose it without consequence. Apologies became patterns, and patterns, once recognized, remove ambiguity. There is no villain in the story. That matters to me. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't malicious. He was consistent in a way that benefited him and cost me. And for a long time, I made that trade willingly because I believed love meant absorbing damage quietly. It doesn't. Love requires accountability. It requires change that shows up when it's inconvenient, not just when it's threatened. And when those things don't exist, staying isn't noble. It's eroding. I don't share this story to warn you away from forgiveness. Forgiveness can be powerful, but it must be paired with boundaries, or it becomes self-erasure. You don't owe anyone infinite understanding at the expense of your own coherence. What I hope you take from this isn't a script for leaving or a checklist for quiet dominance. It's permission. Permission to trust the moment when something inside you settles instead of fighting. Permission to stop explaining pain to people who benefit from not fully understanding it. Permission to move carefully, calmly, and decisively without needing to justify your timing. Strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply withdraws its energy from places where it's been misused. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself, not in the details, but in the dynamic, know this. You don't have to explode to be done. You don't have to convince anyone to understand. You don't have to wait for the right apology or the perfect explanation. You are allowed to leave a situation when clarity arrives, even if it arrives quietly. And you're allowed to build a life that doesn't require you to be endlessly patient to be loved. I'll end with this. Not as advice, but as an honest question, because I believe the answers matter more than the story itself. Have you ever mistaken your ability to endure for a reason to stay? And if so, what did it cost you?